Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. On February 24th, 2019, a woman arrived at a ceramics factory in Hubei province in China. She walked through the front door into the main office where she saw a desk attendant. She informed them she was a quality control inspector and she was there that day to inspect their vehicles. The attendant was accustomed to their company being periodically inspected. She walked past the attendant and out the back door into the very active yard where all day long these huge bulldozers would move around thousands of pounds of sand. And so the inspector walked out that back door and she scanned the yard and she saw there were 2 bulldozers doing just that, moving all around. And then off to the left side, there was a dump truck that seemed to be stationary. At some point, the inspector needed the dump truck driver to back up a significant distance. And so she, the inspector, backed away from the dump truck until she was in the middle of the yard, standing right in front of this parked bulldozer. And so as she's standing there and she's watching the dump truck back up right in front of her, the bulldozer driver right behind her turns on the machine and immediately lurches forward. And so he goes right into her and he knocks her backwards. She falls into the bucket. She starts screaming, but no one can hear her. It's so loud. And the driver drives the bucket directly into a pile of sand and scoops up thousands of pounds of sand that come down directly on this woman. So now she's completely buried alive and being crushed by all this sand. And then the driver, completely oblivious, lifts the bucket up, turns around and drives across the yard and dumps the sand and the woman into a vibrating sand crusher. Now, the driver of this bulldozer did not see the woman, and she was in his blind spot right in front of the bucket of his bulldozer. And he was not aware there was somebody on foot walking around the yard. When the driver dumps his bucket load into the sand crusher, she immediately jumps into action and begins trying to pull herself up and out of this pile. And at some point, she gets most of her upper body out and she waves and she gets the attention of the driver who's just dumped her into the sand crusher. And the driver, he stops right away. He leaps out and he starts running over to the sand crusher. But as he's running over, this woman who's waving and waving disappears under the sand. When this happens, the driver is frantic and he's screaming for other people in the factory to come over and help. And at some point, the others inside, they realize there's an emergency and they all run over. But when they realize what's happened, that someone has fallen into the sand crusher, they all just stop and stand there because they know there's nothing they can do. In June of 2015, 45-year-old James Young landed his dream job. For the last several years, James had been a 5th grade teacher in East Canton, Ohio, teaching special education. And while he loved his job and he loved the kids he worked with, he had always had his eye on becoming a guidance counselor for high school students. James had applied for the job before, but every time he applied, they would tell him that while he was qualified, there just wasn't a spot open for him. However, at the end of that school year, he was told a guidance counselor spot had opened up at the high school and the job was his if he wanted it. And so, of course, James said, yes, I'll take the job. He had a number of very close, lifelong friends that he would spend virtually all of his off time with. And that summer, he did just that. Towards the end of the summer, James and his friends knew it was time to schedule their annual trip to Cedar Point. Cedar Point is an amusement park about 2 hours northwest of East Canton, Ohio. It's situated right on the shores of Lake Erie, and it's known for its incredible roller coasters, of which they had 17, making them the park with the 2nd most roller coasters in the world. After looking at their calendar, they decided that the best day to go would be Thursday, August 13th. This would give the group of friends one more fun thing to do before the following week James started his new job. So on the morning of that Thursday, the friends piled into a car and they made the 2-hour commute up to Cedar Point. And as soon as they got there, they went inside, they grabbed a map, and they began systematically hitting as many rides as they possibly could. And so by 4:30 p.m., they were totally exhausted. They'd been on virtually every ride. And so they were about to call it a day when James and his friends decide, hey, let's go on one more ride before we pack it in. And so they pull out their map and they're looking and they realize they haven't gone on one of their favorite rides. It was called the Raptor. The Raptor was not Cedar Point's biggest roller coaster, but it was their fastest. It would reach a top speed of 57 miles per hour. So James and his friends, they closed up their map and they ran their way over to the Raptor. They got in line and by 4:50 p.m., they had made it to the front of the line. They got into their seats, their harness came down, and then the ride started. And they were pulled up to the top of the hill. They paused, and then they were launched down the track, and for 2 minutes they zipped and zagged and loop-de-looped all through this track And then it was just suddenly over, and the friends had a great time on the ride. Except James realized about halfway through the ride, when they were upside down, his phone and wallet had come out of his pockets, and he actually saw them fall down towards the ground. And although he didn't see exactly where they landed, he had a pretty good idea of where they were. And James said to them, "Hey, I lost my cell phone and wallet. Will you guys come with me while I go look for them?" And so the friends agreed. They left the Raptor station and they walked down the paved path until they were in front of this fence that said no trespassing. And so James gets up to the fence and he's looking inside of this fenced-in area, and he sees right in the middle of this restricted area is his phone and his wallet. And before James's friends could tell him not to do this, he had climbed over the fence and entered into this restricted area. He ran over to his phone and his wallet, he picked it up, and then when he stood back up again, the next wave of Raptor riders came blazing through the area, and the underside, the steel underside of the ride, hit James right in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. And immediately the park officials saw this happen. They stopped the ride, but the riders on board the Raptor, they didn't know what was going on. And so they're stopped on the ride. They're looking down and they hear people screaming, and they look down and they see there's this man, James, lying face down on the ground. The fence James had climbed over was there specifically to keep visitors from getting too close to this one low point in the Raptor ride. And so medical workers, they rush over, they hop over the fence, they get to James, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Today, Cedar Park is still open for business and the Raptor ride is still operational. On August 14th, 2012, Celestino Cervantes picked up 28-year-old Victor Diaz for work. Celestino was an expert roofer, and he had just hired Victor to come on his crew and help him with a particular job. This was going to be Victor's first day as a roofer, but for the past 10 years he had worked in construction, so he was familiar with the operation. The two men arrived at their job site in San Antonio, Texas around 8 a.m. that morning. They were in charge of putting a new roof on a 115-year-old building that was being redeveloped into a fancy steakhouse. Until 2001, this building had been used by a brewing company to house their enormous boilers. As such, this building was referred to as the boiler house. Protruding from the boiler house roof was this large metal duct that was 15 feet long and almost looked like a covered walkway, and it connected to the side of this huge smokestack. This duct and smokestack used to be how the built-up condensation inside the boiler house was able to travel up and out of the building. When the two roofers got out of their truck, Celestino told Victor to take his tools and make his way up to the roof of the boiler house and get to work, and that he had a few things he had to do down on the ground floor, but he would be up to check on him in a little bit. An hour and a half later, Celestino went up to the roof to check on Victor, but he couldn't find Victor anywhere, and he couldn't find his tools anywhere. So Celestino went back down into the main section of this building where other contractors that were working on this renovation were, and he began asking them, "Hey, have you seen this guy, Victor? He works with me, I can't find him," and no one had seen him. And so Celestino's thinking to himself, well, I guess Victor must have left. Now, unfortunately, Victor did not carry a cell phone, so nobody had any way of getting directly in contact with him. So Celestino leaves the building and he calls Victor's brother and he asks him, have you seen Victor? Do you know where he might have gone? And Victor's brother says, no, I haven't seen him since this morning when he left with you. So for the rest of the day, Celestino and the rest of Victor's friends and family, they went out looking for Victor at the job site and around the surrounding areas, but there was just no sign of him. So without any help from the police, Victor's friends and family and co-workers spent the next several days scouring San Antonio, scouring the job site, looking everywhere for him and handing out flyers and asking people if they'd seen him, but no one had. He had just disappeared. So 6 days after Victor has gone missing, they got a call. Victor had been found. 7 days earlier, when Celestino told Victor to head inside and make his way to the roof and begin the project, Victor had gotten his tools, gone inside, he made his way up the stairwell to the second floor, and then he made a series of odd decisions. Instead of making his way to the access door and climbing his way up to the roof, he went to the far side of the second floor where there were all these wooden barriers preventing people from going any farther. He climbed over all these barriers and he reached the entrance to that huge duct where the condensation used to go. And so from his perspective, he would have been looking into this duct and it would have been completely pitch black because it connected to that smokestack and the smokestack was totally sealed off. But despite not having any idea where this tunnel goes and it clearly not being the place Celestino told him to go, Victor decides to just get into this tunnel, which required bending over because it was only 4 feet tall and 5 feet wide. So he gets inside of the this tunnel, and he begins shuffling his way deeper and deeper into this tunnel until he reaches the end of the tunnel where it actually connects into the smokestack. Now, at the top of this duct, where it connects to the smokestack, there wasn't a grate or bars or any sort of barrier that would stop you from spilling into the smokestack. And because it was totally pitch black, Victor, when he made it to the edge of that duct, he just kept on walking and fell 20 feet down to the bottom of the smokestack. And so in total darkness, Victor, who was probably badly hurt from the fall, began feeling around the inside of the chimney looking for a way out. And he eventually found a hatch that was big enough for him to fit through, but when he felt up against it, he realized it was locked from the outside and it wouldn't even budge. He couldn't even get light to come in through a crack. It was totally sealed off. And that was the only way out of the smokestack. He most likely began screaming for help, but he was encased in thick brick, and so his sound wouldn't have traveled. It would have been completely muffled. Plus, the smokestack was fairly far away from the job site, which was very noisy as it is, and so there was just no way they could have heard him. And the smokestack and the duct were not part of the renovation, and so there was absolutely no foot traffic over around the smokestack. He was completely alone, no one knew he was there, and there was no way out. 7 days after Victor fell into the smokestack, workers over at the job site, they noticed this huge swarm of flies over around the base of the smokestack. There were so many flies over there, they decided they had to go investigate. And so as they walked closer and closer to the smokestack, they were hit with this overwhelming stench of death and decay. And then when they got to the smokestack, they could see the flies were centralized on that hatch at the bottom. And so they cut the lock, they opened it up, and inside they found Victor's body. In his final moments, he was desperately trying to open that hatch and save himself, but there was just no way to do that. Although no one knows this for sure, it's believed Victor confused the condensation duct with the access point to the roof.